gonna get. So yeah, let's get started. All right, thank you for coming to our first Thomistic Institute talk of the semester. We're pleased to welcome Professor Jacob Wood of Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. Professor Wood received his PhD in 2014 from Catholic University of America, and has been teaching at Steubenville for how long now?
About 10 years.
About 10 years, all right, in theology, correct?
In theology, that's
Theology, all right. Professor Wood also has an interest in Catholic homesteading, I believe, with your website, Wisdom of Tradition.
Yes.
Okay, yes. And yeah, we're here to, we invited him to give a talk on identity versus nature, Aquinas on who creates nature. He's going to
Very energetic. Well, thank you, Maria, and thank you to all the leadership here and to the Thomistic Institute for sponsoring this talk and bringing me out here. It's a beautiful, very straight drive from Steubenville. Just 7 hours on I-70, and you're basically here. But I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to be here. So, as Maria mentioned, I'm going to talk about identity versus nature. So we're going to be looking at what Thomas Aquinas has to say about nature and putting that in conversation with some contemporary identity theory. Nowadays, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess more people are familiar with identity theory than Aquinas' account of nature, so we're going to spend a little more time there. This is the Thomistic Institute, after all. And then we'll turn to identity theory at the end, so let's begin. In order to understand what it means to be human, we first have to ask what it means to be anything at all, why there's such a diversity of creatures on Earth, and what it means to be one creature rather than another. In the physics, Aristotle describes 4 ways in which we can talk about what makes a thing to be what it is. We can talk about what it's made of, we can talk about the shape into which it's made, we can talk about who or what made it into that shape, and we can talk about what its purpose is. So to take one classic example, you could imagine a bronze statue of a horse. First, we can talk about what it's made of. Aristotle describes this as its material cause, and in this example, the answer is bronze. Not bronze already fashioned into the shape of a horse, but bronze without any shape or form at all. It's impossible to imagine this perfectly, because in this world, matter never exists without form. Anytime you try to imagine bronze, you're going to imagine some kind of shape or other, but for the sake of illustration, picture a lump of bronze sitting there in the sculptor's shop on the shelf. That lump makes a statue to be bronze. Next, we can talk about the shape. Aristotle describes this as the statue's formal cause. Technically, you can't imagine the shape of a horse outside of matter any more than you can imagine matter without some shape. But if you try to picture in your mind the most generic horse possible, perhaps a stick figure, which, if I was going to embarrass myself, I would attempt to draw this board here, the shape makes the statue to be the horse. So we've got bronze on the one hand and horse on the other, and we're trying to imagine them separately, but we can't do so perfectly. We need to put them together in some way. And in the real world, that's the job of a sculptor. The sculptor is the one who does the work of making a casting, melting down the bronze, pouring it into the casting, cooling it, and thus combining the matter and the form into a bronze horse. And Aristotle describes the sculptor as the statue's efficient cause, the agent who combines its matter and form so you can get a sculpture. But why is the sculptor busy in his workshop making a bronze horse in the first place when he could be at home drinking a beer and watching the football game? What is the statue of a bronze horse for? And that's a more complicated question, but it also tells us something about what the bronze horse is. Is it a paperweight, a decoration for someone's shelf, the top of a trophy, the centerpiece of a monument in the center of a city? There's got to be some reason that motivates the sculptor to get up off the couch, turn off the television, stop watching the football game, and make the bronze horse. It could be for fun, for beauty, for money, to impress someone, to practice his craft, a civic duty that he's been assigned, or maybe he's just obsessed with horses. The possibilities are nearly endless, but not completely endless, and that's because the matter in the form of a bronze horse impose certain limits on what the horse can be formed. A bronze horse is not very useful for sweeping the floor of your workshop or painting its ceiling. And it can't really help you rake up the leaves outside, or if you snuggle it, it's not going to keep you very warm on a cold winter's night. Bronze doesn't do these things, and neither do horses. All the more so does a bronze horse not do them either. In these situations, you need other materials with other shapes made by other craftsmen, because each combination of matter and form, each material thing, has limits. Can there be things that are good for sweeping the floor, painting your ceiling, raking your leaves, keeping you warm at night? Absolutely. But to sweep, you need a broom made of wicker, to paint a brush made of bristles, to gather leaves a rake made of metal, plastic, whatever. To keep you warm at night, a blanket made of cotton, wool, or down. Wicker doesn't make a good statue, and bronze doesn't make a good broom. Horses don't sweep floors, and brooms don't make particularly good monuments. In the whole of creation, there are materials that are useful for some things and materials that are useful for other things. And the challenge of a good craftsman is to find the right material, to fashion it into the right shape for the right job. When that happens, you can use a real thing in real life to fulfill the purpose for which it was made. And when that doesn't happen, you can't. Given that there are 4 causes that go into making a thing to be what it is, Aristotle asks in the Physics, which of them is most important, which plays the biggest role in causing a thing to be what it is. And he centers in, he homes in on form. That's because form gives to matter 2 things that matter can't give to itself. First, it makes it to be something. Matter, raw material, can be fashioned into nearly anything. Our lump of bronze could become a horse or a dog or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. When it's still a lump, it has the potential to be any of these things. But as a lump, it's pretty useless. Only when we limit the range of the things it could possibly become, by fulfilling its potential to actually become one of those things, does the lump of bronze become useful in some way. If we fashion it into a horse, we can have a paperweight, an ornament, a monument, but we can't have a bust of George Washington. The reverse is also true. In either case, we fulfill the potential for the bronze to be something, but only at the cost of limiting its potential to be any of the other things it could have ever been. In this way, form gives to matter a nature, a more limited set of potential to be this and not that, to do this and not that. The second thing that form does to matter is that it makes it to be at all. This one's hard to conceptualize and takes a bit of imagining, but it's equally important. If a lump of bronze has lots of potential, but isn't very useful until you actualize its potential to be one thing rather than another, what would pure matter, prime matter in the language of Aquinas, be like? Something that was in pure potential to be anything at all, but didn't even have the shape of a lump. Aquinas' answer is that it wouldn't be at all. Pure potentiality doesn't exist, because the moment something comes into existence, it exists as something, and not as something else. A lump of bronze is still bronze, and it's still a lump. If you had pure matter, it would be pure potency to become anything in any shape. So Aristotle, and Aquinas with him, says that form not only gives form not only gives nature to matter, but also existence to matter. It simultaneously makes a thing to be, and also limits its potential to a certain set of abilities and orientation towards a specific purpose. But where do nature and being, essence, and existence come from? That's a more complicated question, but it's at the very center of the relationship between nature and identity. Aquinas answers this question in the midst of his famous five ways or five proofs for the existence of God. For our purposes today, we'll focus on the second way. Looking at the natural world around us, Aquinas begins with the simple observation that nothing is the cause of itself. In one sense, that's just a logical truism. If a thing caused itself, Aquinas observes, then it would have to pre-exist itself, which is impossible, because that would violate the law of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. But it's also something that can be readily observed in the world around us. A plant doesn't cause itself, it comes from a seed. A seed doesn't cause itself, it comes from another plant. Baby animals don't cause themselves, they come from their parents. And their parents don't cause themselves, they come from their parents. So when we look at the world around us, we don't see things that cause themselves, we see a series of things in which one thing causes another, and that thing causes the next, and so on and so forth. So where did the various series of causes come from? Is it turtles all the way down, as the ancient myth would have it? That's a trickier question, and Aquinas tackles it from a few different angles. First, he homes in on the fact that every series of causes has an order to it, with some definite purpose, which is to say it has a final cause. The food chain is a perfect example of this. If we're looking at an oak tree, the key to the series of causes is the production of acorns. The production of acorns serves a twofold purpose. It helps perpetuate the existence of oak trees, and it feeds animals like squirrels, chipmunks, and birds. If we're looking at the squirrels, the key to the series of causes is the generation of baby squirrels. These two serve a twofold purpose: the perpetuation of the existence of squirrels, and the feeding of animals yet higher on the food chain: coyotes, foxes, bobcats. And even at the top of the food chain, an animal like a bobcat follows the same pattern. The generation of bob kittens perpetuates the existence of bobcats, and they in turn take over from their parents in regulating the health of the food chain below them. So where did all these ordered series come from? Each with their purpose, and all with their purposes interlinked and coordinated with one another. Aquinas argues that there must be some first cause that explains the existence of the other causes in the series, together with the fact that they are all interlinked together. We can see examples of this all around us. Think of a building. Without an architect, all you have is a pile of building materials instead of a building. Or imagine an orchestra. Without a composer, all you have is a bunch of meaningless noise instead of a symphony. To get things into an ordered series, you need an intelligent agent to order them. Otherwise, all you have is random chaos. And it's no different in the natural universe. Without a first cause, all you have is a bunch of meaningless chaos instead of species and an ecosystem. In the natural universe, we can take Aquinas' argument a step further than we can with the examples of building or a symphony. Architects work with pre-existing building materials and conductors with mature musicians. But in the natural universe, we're not only talking about how things fit together, we're also talking about how the pieces got there at all. After all, part of the ordered series of the natural universe is the production of the things in it, plants coming from seeds, animals coming from their parents, and so on and so forth. This means that for the ordered series that is the natural universe to exist, there must be some first cause that explains not only how the pieces fit together, but why each piece exists in the first place. And also, why it exists with the particular properties and purpose that it has, that is to say, why it has the nature that it has. Aquinas says that this first cause is what all people call God, an intelligent being outside the universe that confers being and nature upon the things in the universe and orders them together with one another into various series of causes. Without God, we don't just have chaos, we actually have nothing, because we have no beings. Conversely, the minute we have beings, we have both natures and order, because the moment God makes beings, he confers nature and order upon them. Okay, so far, our discussion of nature has been relatively generic. What does all this look like in the case of human beings? We're here to talk about ourselves, after all. Human beings are somewhat of an anomaly among all living creatures. Every other living creature is confined to a life lived at the level of material bodily existence and can be studied at that level. But human beings straddle the immaterial and the material, the universal and the particular, the spiritual and the bodily realms of existence. And that makes human life more interesting than animal life, because it's ordered above the level of the material world to the world of knowledge and love. In Aquinas' account of the universe, knowledge and love may be above material creation, but they are by no means outside of it. In unpacking the Christian doctrine of creation, Aquinas explains that God freely chose to create precisely in order that he might share his spiritual perfections with creatures, as much as each creature could possibly receive. Now, no one creature can possibly contain a perfect and complete reflection of all the perfection of God. Each creature, in its nature, reveals some tiny and in an imperfect way the glory of the one who made it. At the pinnacle of creation are human beings who are made in the image and likeness of God, precisely insofar as we are uniquely able to share not only in the life of other animals, but also in the knowledge and love of God who made us. In terms of the human body, no one disputes that there are things that are good for us and things that are bad for us. That's because it's an observable fact that the things that are good for us, a well-balanced diet, regular exercise, and all those other things we should be doing, make us regularly and observably healthy, while things that aren't good for us make us regularly and observably sick. What doctor in their right mind would counsel you to go on a diet of brownies, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola? The doctors don't do that because they know it's bad for you. You hopefully don't do it either because you know that it's bad for you too. We can't change the nature of our bodies, but we can study it and learn how to take good care. But the body's only one part of human nature. Since human beings have both the body and a soul, we need to devote equal study, care, and attention to the study of the soul, to the things that are good for it, to the things that are bad for it. In classical philosophy, these are the virtues and the vices, respectively. Virtues are habits that perfect some aspect of our nature by working with it, and vices are habits that corrupt some aspect of our nature by working against it. A good example is the virtue of temperance. The temperate person interacts reasonably with things that cause pleasure or pain. The intemperate person doesn't. The temperate person recognizes that one brownie is an appropriate dessert, but not 10, and so limits himself or herself to an appropriately sized dessert at the end of dinner. The intemperate person may know that he or she should limit himself or herself to one brownie, but the desire for more overwhelms their reason and they fill their plate to overflowing. With enough intemperance, the intemperate person may even lose touch with the idea of temperance entirely. But that's not going to stop the natural consequences to that person's body from setting in, pound after pound after pound. And it's no different with the soul. The psychologists tell us that things like food addiction are not purely the result of giving in to a hunger craving. With any addiction, there's also a psychological component. We not only look for the pleasure of eating a sweet, tasty thing, but more so for the fleeting comfort that that pleasure brings us. It sets us up for a vicious cycle. We give ourselves over to something, we feel fulfilled for a moment, then it lets us down, so we give ourselves over to it again. And it's the same with other addictions, whether physical or spiritual. Drugs, alcohol, sex, pornography, the pursuit of money, fame, power, you name it. What all these pursuits have in common is that they aren't good for us. And the sign that they aren't good for us is that as we freely choose to give ourselves over to them yet more completely, we slowly lose our freedom to them. They say the sign of an addiction is when you can't stop even when you want to. That is to say, when it takes away your freedom. And slowly it begins to take over your life, as your pursuit of it becomes more all-encompassing. With enough of an addiction, the addict may lose touch with normal life entirely. But again, that won't stop the natural consequences to his or her soul from setting in time after time after time. So how do we go about living a truly free life? That depends on what we mean by freedom. The Thomistic moral theologian Survey Pinker says that there are two basic ways to talk about freedom. One is freedom from constraint. In a sense, we exercise that kind of freedom anytime we make any choice at all, good or bad. The very definition of a free choice is that no one forced us to make it. But as we've seen, some choices we can make, if they are contrary to our nature, actually end up imposing constraints on our freedom as time goes by. That is to say, that if we make bad choices, if we make choices that are contrary to our nature, we can use our freedom to lose our freedom. So Pink Hairs offers us a second kind of freedom, freedom for excellence. Freedom for excellence is a freedom from the constraints that we impose on ourselves by choices that are contrary to our nature. The only way to attain that kind of freedom is to act in accord with our nature regularly and consistently. That is to say, to act virtuously. For the better part of the last century, the idea that we should act regularly and consistently in accord with our nature has become increasingly, and I say this with full force, increasingly terrifying. Not an exaggeration. In his famous book, Being in Time, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger gave shape to what this terror looks like and feels like. Heidegger thought that our default mode as human beings is to be part of the crowd. That is, part of a sea of people leading a so-called normal life. Going to school, here we are, getting married, having a family, holding down a job, retiring, helping to raise grandchildren, and then you know what comes next. Heidegger described leading a normal life like this as a kind of falling. That is, falling towards failure. The failure of wasting our personal potential to be more than just a nameless space in a sea of existence. To truly succeed in life, Heidegger proposed that we need to wake up and decide to become an individual. That we need to take responsibility for our individuality by choosing to make something of ourselves. By definition here, making something of ourselves means standing out. Doing something outside the normal course of life, boring course of life that everyone else is living. For Heidegger, this is how you give yourself what later scholars will refer to as a personal identity. In a sense, you not only determine who you are, but what you are as well. And this theory of the purpose of human life is commonly called expressive individualism. It is literally the foundation for the plotline of every Disney movie ever made. Okay, while it's virtuous to realize your potential for excellence through personal choices that develop your natural gifts, the problem with Heidegger's thought is that it sets up an opposition between authenticity and identity on the one hand, and nature on the other. That's because large amounts of normal everyday existence are in fact just part of what it means to live according to nature. Going to school, having family, holding down a job are normal because nature itself inclines us to do these things as part of certain what Aquinas calls natural inclinations. To self-preservation, having and raising children, knowing the truth, living in society. In other words, they're normal because they're good for us. And they're good for us, we know, because nature inclines us to them. So if in the quest to lead a better than normal life, to avoid the failure of wasted potential, we tell ourselves that we have to step out from normal life to be uniquely individual, the danger is that we'll quickly start to think, whether implicitly or later explicitly, that to be authentic, to be real, to be in some sense ourselves, we have to act contrary to nature. The moment that happens, we're in danger. We've got the angel and the devil whispering different things on our shoulders. From one side, we hear that we should live according to nature to be happy and free. From the other side, we hear that we have to live, in some respects, contrary to nature to be happy and free. If we listen to the darker of these two voices, then our quest for authenticity and individuality might well lead down the same road that misused freedom always does, to the point that you lose your freedom rather than gaining it, and need to be rescued to have it restored once more. Over the course of the 20th century, the antipathy between nature and identity gradually increased. One of the most important milestones in the increase of that opposition is in the work of Judith Butler, a contemporary philosopher of gender studies. Gender studies is a field where there's always been a fair bit of tension between nature and identity. That's because although a division according to male and female is natural to the human species, and so as a biological reality imposes certain conditions in terms of what can contribute to or detract from our human flourishing, like the existence of parents, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles, and the like. Okay? There's always been a large amount of cultural diversity in terms of how life surrounding the biological realities of male and female are lived out. There are some realities that don't change even in the most advanced reproductive technologies. But beyond those most basic realities, families can look a little bit different in different cultures. What family looks like in America might look a little different in England, or might look a little different in Germany, or outside of Europe in another continent. Each human culture has to adapt and apply the realities and needs of human nature to its particular setting. Previous thinkers in anthropology and gender studies tried to account for the need to apply and adapt nature's realities to particular settings by distinguishing between terms which they divided as sex, which they would say describes a person's natural biological characteristics, and gender, which they would say would describe a person's cultural role. But truth be told, there was always a bit of tension between these two categories. Does sex determine gender? Or to put it more specifically, are there certain roles that are natural to men and women, and which therefore transcend cultures? If so, how far do those roles extend beyond the natural, biological, or we might even just say medical facts associated with human reproduction? Butler sought to eliminate this tension. If previous generations had erred on the side of reducing gender to sex, Butler went in the other direction by reducing sex to gender. In her book, Gender Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity, your gender is what you choose to do rather than a component of what you are. It is one aspect of the identity you select in the pursuit of authenticity. It has no anchor whatsoever in a sort of natural reality, including the biological realities of human reproduction. In a sense, Butler took Heidegger's work to its logical conclusion. If the key to authentic life is to stick out beyond the crowd, then aren't the groups male and female two very large crowds from which one would want to stick out? Butler didn't stop at trying to open up the possibility of stepping out between male and female. She also tried to create a sense of a moral imperative to do so. She did that by suggesting that the normal social systems that assign binary genders are not just bland and unfulfilling, as Heidegger's work might be extended to imply, but are in fact oppressive, because they are inextricably bound up with systems of domination. She did this by adding something to Heidegger from the work of the continental philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault thought that if we want to understand how power is exercised in society, we need to look not just at labels and titles, but at what actually happens. Who people actually listen to, how people actually treat, and in many instances use one another, how people actually lead, and who people actually follow. He was particularly attentive to how these dynamics play out in the relationship between the genders. Butler added to Foucault's understanding of how power is pervasively and abusively wielded. Butler added Foucault's understanding of how power is pervasively and abusively wielded to Heidegger's understanding of normal life, to suggest that leading a normal life, in this case, one that is simply male or female, is not just something undesirable to be transcended if we want to be fulfilled, but something oppressive and toxic which we need to be liberated from if we want to survive. Because in this case, the labels male and female, these two large crowds from which we are allegedly supposed to want to stick out, are impositions on our freedom from outside. But those kinds of impositions don't come for no reason. They come particularly by means of an assertion of power over ourselves. So what do? Butler suggests that we should create for ourselves our own gender identity. This identity establishes not only who, but in a certain sense, what we are. And since Butler's understanding of gender identity is not tied to a binary biological reality, the possibilities for potential gender identities are nearly endless. All the more so if we consider that Butler's understanding of gender identity not only seeks to transcend the categories of man and woman, but also any sense of a normative biological complementarity between them. Aquinas and Butler present us with contrasting views of who or what creates me. And applying a Thomistic analysis to Butler's thought leaves us with several important questions to consider. The first regards existence itself. According to Butler, one may choose any identity one wishes. But to choose an identity, a person must first exist. And while Butler's argument advises a person what to do once that person exists, the choice of an identity cannot change the fact that each existing person choosing an identity exists as part of an ordered series of causes, with their parents bringing them into existence, and their parents bringing them into existence, and so on and so forth. Aquinas' argument in favor of the existence of nature proceeds first and foremost on that logically prior level. Without a first cause, the ordered series of causes of which individual human beings are a part simply wouldn't exist. And therefore we ourselves would not exist, and all the more so would we not be sitting around choosing gender identities. Yet as the first cause, God not only creates the series, but also the nature that gives that series its order. And the ordering in the series is a result of the nature. The second regards to the goal of existence. For Aquinas, natures are ordered towards ends, and the end of human nature is to be found in the knowledge and love of God. Butler's expressive individualism places human perfection in a different end, the exercise of freedom in the choice of an identity even and above any sense of nature. But does the choice of an identity perfect or distract from our freedom? Aquinas argues that we do have a certain level of freedom in choosing who we want to become and how we want to live out our humanity in a given setting at a given time. But that we don't have the freedom to choose what we fundamentally are or where our happiness is ultimately to be found. For Aquinas, any choice to place something other than God at the center of our lives diminishes our freedom, because the use of our freedom for things contrary to our nature always results in the concrete lessening of our freedom as we become attached to the objects of our choices. In this way, freedom itself, if we exalt it over the knowledge and love of God, can sow the seeds of its own destruction. We can become addicted to ever-increasing exercises of freedom in the search for authenticity, and as a result, act in ways that are increasingly harmful to our nature, body, and soul. Lastly, a third question concerns our relationships with one another. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas asks how it is that we should talk with one another about difficult but important subjects that we disagree about. Something that as a culture we're not particularly good at these days. His answer is that any productive discussion has to take place on the basis of some common and shared assumptions. So the examples he gives: Catholics share the teaching of the Catholic Church. Catholic and non-Catholic Christians share the New Testament. Christians and members of the Jewish people share the Old Testament. But what about people outside the Judeo-Christian tradition? Aquinas says that with people outside our religious tradition, we can always carry on a discussion on the basis of our shared humanity. That is to say, on the basis of our shared nature. That nature, which we've all received equally from God, gives us a set of common experiences and common principles from which we can speak reasonably with any other human person about the basic facets of human life, even if we have to sometimes do a fair bit of translating on particulars. But what if our nature is subject to change, or rather, to choice? If our choices can determine not only in a sense who, but also what we are, we lose our capacity for common discourse each time two people select two different identities. And the proliferation of identities according to the proliferation of possibilities means that our common discourse becomes exponentially fragmented, as indeed it has become. In many ways, I think that's what we're experiencing today with the echo chambers and increasingly aggressive rhetoric on both sides of the political spectrum. My hope is that if we return to Aquinas' understanding of nature as given by God in order to a common end, we can begin to repair the damage and take up our common calling to ultimate happiness, shared happiness, in the perfection of our human nature once more. Thank you very much. There's plenty of potential topics in there to discuss, so I wanted to leave plenty of time for us to have a discussion. We've got time for questions. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, fire away.
What does Aquinas believe the nature is? So does he think it's like a set of attributes, or does he think it's like I don't know, like embedded in the human soul or something?
Yes, it is embedded in the human soul. He thinks the nature is what confers upon the thing what it is and that it is. And so there's a whole lot of different things that exist, okay? And each of them has a principle inside it that causes it to be what it is. And Aquinas would call that its nature.
So, I have a question about, you talked a bit about the concept of infinite regress.
Turtles all the way down.
How do, again, I hear like the common response of why God is able to get out of the infinite regress is that it's the creator, like it's an infinite entity. So tell me, what would cause like the infinite entity to begin with? Exactly. Like how does it truly escape the infinite regress?
We have the chalkboard here. Okay, excellent. So, if it's turtles all the way down, or it's an infinite series of things going on forever, okay? You said that God was infinite, but infinite can be said in different ways. We could say infinite in terms of infinitely extending the series, right? Or we could say infinite in an analogous way of transcending the series entirely. What Aquinas wants to do is not ask, how do we get to the end of the series, or more often, how do we get to the beginning of the series? He wants to ask, why is there a series? How did the series get there? And when you ask the question, who created God, you're just making God another member of the series. This is a different question. How and why is there a series at all? And he's pointing to the idea that you have a series, and also that the series has an ordering, that's why we call it a series, and that the series seems to have some kind of goal, forward-moving goal towards which it tends. So the existence of order and the existence of purpose, directionality, we would say teleology, more technically, okay, implies the existence of an intelligence that's not in the series. It's over and above the series. That's different than the series, and which causes the series to have ordering and to have that directionality in its ordering. So that's what we're talking about, Aquinas says. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about God. So he's not infinite in the way that an infinite series is infinite. He's infinite in a way that transcends the series entirely.
God, thank you.
That phrase, turtles all the way down, what is that referring to?
That's referring to an ancient myth that I believe comes from Hindu mythology, describing the nature of the world. So the idea was that you have an animal, and the world sits on the back of an animal, and in different myths there are different proposed animals that the world is sitting on top of.
Okay.
And then, one common animal to choose was a turtle, because they have a shell and it kind of looks like land, and you're kind of sitting on top of that. And you say, well, what's the turtle sitting on? Another turtle. And what's that turtle sitting on? Another turtle. Well, what's below that? It's turtles all the way down. And so the idea would be that is in fact an infinite series. And Aquinas is trying to get out of that argument. Now, he never heard the turtle version of that argument, but he knew about infinite series, that he's trying to get over and above the infinite series.
Okay. What's God standing on? Is that turtle?
Body, he's not standing on anything.
He's not standing on the turtles?
Speaking at the level of metaphysics, you're standing on him.
Huh?
I said, speaking at the level of metaphysics, you're standing on him.
Oh, there's still on a body?
In the order of being.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was curious about how you connected the philosophy of Heidegger and Judith Butler,
Yes.
and used the term that she builds off of things that Heidegger implies, but
Yeah.
perhaps doesn't explicitly say.
It happens a lot in the philosophical tradition. Right. They were both saying that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato. It's a long conversation. People draw out implications.
I'm curious, do you think Heidegger would agree with Judith Butler's philosophy? Or do you think
they lived in two wildly different worlds? very wildly different worlds. I think he would be very perplexed by them, quite honestly. But I think if they could have stood and talked to one another, they would be equally perplexed by one another. And that's what often happens in the philosophical tradition as things progress and as things develop. You might draw out the logical implications of somebody else's thought, but if they were confronted with you, they would be perplexed by that. Because it's difficult for us sometimes to see the logical implications of our own thoughts. That's why it helps to be a member of a community thinking these things out together. Sometimes it's uncomfortable when that happens, but it helps us refine our thinking.
I have a question about the Heidegger discussion too. I mean, a simple way to put it is just that authenticity or individuality is going to carry the risks that you associate with it, only to the extent that the mass culture that you're part of is a healthy culture. Another way to put the word. I mean, plenty of saints fit Heidegger's description of the authentic individual standing out from the crowd. If I remember correctly, there's thought that he takes that from some parts of Kierkegaard. So I mean, it doesn't seem like it can simply be, and I don't think this is what you're saying.
Yeah.
That you should follow the crowd.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay.
So we actually have at Franciscan University, where I come from, we have an office of personal vocation. The idea being to try to help people figure out who is the individual that God is calling me to be. Now, the very existence of such an office, it could be implied, taking my talk, this is talking about logical implications in a certain direction, like that's a bad thing. And quite honestly, the theological tradition is a little bit tense on this question of, what exactly is vocation? I mean, is it just to the priesthood, just to religious life? Do people individually get called by God? I think that Scripture seems to suggest that they do, but in large parts of the theological tradition, that doesn't receive a lot of attention. But Scripture is very clear that God calls us all by name, that we have some kind of individuality before Him. I think you're right. The question is, if we're sticking out beyond the crowd for the sake of sticking out beyond the crowd, then we have a problem. You might even say, even if you live in a culture that's vicious and you're going to stick out by virtue, if you're sticking out for the sake of sticking out, that's actually pride. If you happen to stick out for the sake of pursuing virtue, okay, that's a good thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I guess another part of it is, another part of Heidegger's critique is just, right, that he talks about, chatter, like just meaningless talk, there's this, and there's the kind of emptiness, boringness, we're just kind of, we're just passing time until we end up in the ground,
Yeah, right.
that's the kind of thing that one seems like as such should want to rebel against, and instead talk should be oriented toward, truth and getting at the heart of the matter and so on. So that's another kind of, I don't know. I know you're not denying any of this.
No, well,
Maybe.
I'll say this. There was a time in my life when I was in graduate school, and I felt very similar. Now I'm at a time in my life where, yes, I teach theology, and then I go home and I farm. And hanging around farmers, they're usually not talking philosophy. They're usually having exactly the kinds of conversations that would probably make Heidegger cringe. And yet there's something beautiful and something very holy about passing the time in such a wholesome way. And that's my worry, is that we feel like we have to step out beyond the wholesome to achieve something better. As though there were something better than being wholesome. And you can be wholesome shooting the breeze on a farm, before you jam your foot into the digging spade and put the next, take the next load of dirt out of your hole. And you can be wholesome in a philosophy department pursuing the truth. I don't think that the one negates the other, vice versa. Now, On the contrary, you will also hear plenty of farmers thinking that what goes on in a university is totally and utterly useless. Right? I mean, it cuts both ways.
Can you put down the use of that word wholesome? What do you mean, like wholesome in terms of performance sense and philosophy sense?
Yeah, wholesome in the sense of contributing to the flourishing of the human person. That we thrive when we spend time in community, in communion with one another. And I mean, we have a word for people that don't do it, it's sociopath, right? Aquinas is actually borrowing from Cicero when he says we have a natural inclination to live in community. It's slightly different than Aristotle says we're political animals, but he needs something slightly different than that.
Is that contrary to Heidegger's idea of like departing from the crowd?
Well, that's kind of, I think, what we're discussing, is whether in what sense you must depart from the crowd, or whether the crowd is something you might want to stay together in. And what Aquinas is going to do is he's going to apply a different analysis to it. It's not being a part of the crowd or not being a part of the crowd, it's virtue and vice, right? If the crowd is a virtuous crowd, it's like your mom told you to pick good friends, If the crowd is a vicious crowd, it's like your mom told you to get away from the bad friends and go make good friends, because the crowd that you're with is going to have an effect on you. And depending on the virtue or vice in the crowd, that would determine whether to what extent you want to stick out beyond it in that Heideggerian sense. But I want to come back to this question of the saints, because even in a virtuous crowd, they still stick out. And the more I think about that, the more I want to apply Aquinas' analysis of the purpose of creation to the saints. That for him, why are there so many things? And it's because no one thing can perfectly image God's perfection. So he creates the myriad of creatures to give us so many different reflections of himself. And so one way we could misunderstand then what it means to be made in the image of God, it's like, okay, so here we are at like the top of the pyramid, so we collectively as a humanity most image God. That's true in a sense. But we also want to remember that no individual human person completely images God, unless you're talking about Jesus, because he is God, right? Because of the incarnation, no individual human person images God. And so as we advance in a life of virtue and in a life of holiness, the ancient the church fathers distinguished between the image of God and the likeness of God. We're all in his image, but some images look more like what they're supposed to than others, right? I mean, Michelangelo's David, which I cannot reproduce for you, but that could be an image of David, right? I mean, especially if I label it David.
That's a masterpiece right there.
Masterpiece.
Sell that for $5 billion.
I mean, it's priceless, actually. But it looks nothing like Michelangelo's David. Michelangelo's David looks like a person. Mine doesn't. They're both images, but only one is in the likeness. And so the saints are those people who have attained, through a life of virtue, the most likeness to God. And yet no person can perfectly image the likeness of God. So I think God creates the myriad of people to become a myriad of saints that each one would image him in a different way. They're all in his image, they look like him in a different way. And so, like I said, where I come from, we talk a lot about personal vocation. I think somewhere in there is the answer to that question. So the concept of identity is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when identity has to mean stepping out beyond nature, then you have a problem. But the saints, I'll get you in just a second. Aquinas has this wonderful principle: grace doesn't destroy, but presupposes and perfects nature. And so in the saints, you see the perfection not only of grace, but also of human nature and perfect human flourishing. Yeah.
So then how do you discern what's a part of your nature and what you should, and where you have freedom? Is it a part of my nature that I should be a philosophy graduate student, or do I have more freedom and I can be a political science philosophy graduate student?
Aristotle wants you to be both, the philosopher or queen in this case. So we have to, nature is a universal. It applies to everyone. And then nature is individualized or concretized in each individual person. And each individual person is going to have a set of natural gifts and we want to call them natural liabilities. We're all good at some things and not good at other things. And each individual person is going to live in an individual setting, surrounding with other individual peoples. It's very, very particular. So the challenge of human life is trying to navigate your individual personhood and setting virtuously. And the virtues are the same for all of us. Prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, to name the 4 cardinal virtues. But a virtue is just a habit that inclines you to act rightly. So it's like a disposition, it kind of impels you to do the right thing. But you don't ever do the right thing except in particular circumstances. So, to pick out an example, in the talk I used the example of brownies. Well, one person at learning to act temperately has to face the temptation to brownies. Another person has to face the temptation to cake. Another person has to face the temptation to drink that 3rd, 4th, or 5th beer. There's different objects of temptation in different settings, but the same habit inclines us to the same generic thing, acting healthily. So, God made you, and He made you with a specific set of gifts, and He made you in a specific setting, and so the challenge is to figure out what is the virtuous way to navigate the situation that God made me in. And, within that situation, sometimes there may be many good choices. It's like when you go to a buffet, and if you're like me, when you go to a restaurant and you stare at the menu, and the more items on the menu, the harder it is to make a decision. It's like, well, what? I gotta find the right one. And the answer is, sometimes if you're presented with a bunch of good options, there isn't a right one, necessarily. What there is many opportunities, to either have a good meal in the case of the restaurant, or many opportunities to live a virtuous life. It's okay if you want to study political science. Just a more particular discipline than philosophy, that's all. It's also okay if you want to study philosophy. Aquinas would approve.
I kind of want to piggyback off of that and head back slightly to an earlier example, maybe it's because I'm a musician, but the idea of the symphony.
Yes.
And you were speaking, of course, about the conductor, but
Or the composer.
well, the composer, yes.
Either one, I think I mentioned both.
What if, let's say in our society today, that we're all in the orchestra, but someone has taken away our score. We have no idea what notes we're supposed to sing. Maybe we have the first chord, but nothing after that. How do we reclaim the melodic line, that harmonic language? How do we find that when everyone's playing cacophony around us?
Funny you should mention that. I will commend to all of you reading Augustine's City of God. It's only 22 books and more than 1,000 pages, but every single one is worth it. In that, now let me try to remember here. Don't quote me on this, I want to say it's book 17, but there's a lot of pages, so I might be a little off.
Alright, cast my balance.
In there, Augustine is talking about sin and grace. And he's in dialogue with a group of philosophers called the Neo-Pythagoreans. And he in dialogue with them, he starts talking about music. He starts talking about music in relationship to salvation history. And if you've ever read J.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, it's very similar to this. I think he might have been borrowing a little bit from Augustine. And he says, basically what happens with sin is, if there's harmony in existence, we lose the harmony and we lose our way back to it. And what he basically says is that Jesus, when he comes to this earth, he's like someone who walks in and plays a new bass note and says, we're gonna start the harmony again from this note right here. And then he walks us through the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So the answer, how do we reclaim the melody? The answer is we actually don't. the only thing that we could reclaim would be like John Cage 433. We could all just shut up. But that's not a symphony either. That's just the absence of music. It's a very boring piece of music. So we need someone else to help us, give us a new starting point and lead us through the chord progression that's going to get us back from the disharmony into which we've fallen into the harmony that we want to be playing. And that someone is the incarnate Lord, who is God, but he's also fully human. So just like we were talking before about the saints, and grace doesn't destroy nature, it presupposes and perfects it. So the saints are people in whom human nature is fully alive. Of course, the Lord Jesus, who had no sin in him, is the perfection of human nature. And that's why in Vatican II, the document Gaudium et Spes says that Christ reveals humanity to itself. What do you mean by that? I'm human. All I gotta do is like look at myself in the mirror, right? Yeah, but what we see when we look in the mirror is a human being who's been wounded by sin and needs saving by grace. When we look at Jesus, we see a human person as it was intended to be. So he just kind of plants that note there. And if we join with him, then we can begin to sing once more.
Oh, you talked about like virtue.
Yeah.
And like how certain actions are more virtuous than others.
Yes.
Okay. So I see you believe in the concept of virtue ethics.
Yes.
How do you know what Christian virtue ethic? Okay, Christian virtue ethics. How do you know what is like the correct interpretation of virtue ethics, and not just simply a random person saying, okay, this works, this doesn't work, like not just random people picking and choosing. Like how do you know this is the correct virtue ethics?
That would require a longer answer than we probably have time for. But I'll say this. Two things. That question can be answered either on the level of philosophy or on the level of theology, and the answers are different. They arrive at similar places, but they come from different first principles. So the way that Thomistic virtue ethics works is by looking at the natural inclinations of human nature towards certain, what Aquinas would call natural goods. Self-preservation, having your own children, knowing the truth, and living in society. And then evaluating individual actions based upon the extent to which they lead us towards the achievement of those goods or not. And then moving from those actions to looking at what kinds of habits incline us to the actions that achieve those goods. The habits or virtues. Or what kind of habits lead us to actions that don't achieve those goods. Those would be vices. So that is one philosophical way to do that, and that's the way Aquinas does it when he's talking in the order of philosophy. That's not the only way to go about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a very large philosophical field, but since it's a Thomistic Institute, that's how Aquinas does it. Now, you could also proceed theologically so in Christianity, when we talk about theology, we're reflecting on God, because every ology is about something. Theos is the Greek word for God. And theology studies God and other things in relation to him. Its first principles are not in this world. Its first principles are scripture and tradition, God's own revelation to us. So how do you know that that's true? And that's a question of, it's a question that can't be answered purely by natural reason. It requires faith. But that doesn't mean we can't say anything about it. So if you would ask Aquinas or really any of the church fathers about this question, you would say, well, is there any way at all that you could know that Christian revelation is authentic? And they say, well, you can't demonstrate it like you can demonstrate math or you can make a philosophical demonstration. But you can look for reasons why it would be very, very reasonable to believe that. And so, in Scripture, you have a host of these reasons, mainly prophecy and miracles. And in the first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul points to the resurrection of Jesus. He says, well, why should we believe Jesus? And he says, because, basically, and I paraphrase obviously, from the history of the world, dead people tend not to get back up again. And you do have these like miraculous instances, some are even recorded in the Old Testament, of one person raising another person from the dead. But the one thing that never happens is dead people raising themselves from the dead. Because dead people tend to stay dead.
Yeah, except for Rocky.
Except for Rocky. And Jesus. This man did something that only God could do.
Yeah, they didn't need to do a prayer, like in the Book of Kings.
So this man did something that only God could do. And so it would seem reasonable to believe the things that he says, because it seems as though God himself has authenticated. That's how St. Paul would answer the question, how do you know? And so Christian revelation not only tells us stuff directly about God, like that he's a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or that Jesus is the Son of God, okay? Christian revelation also tells us about ourselves. And it tells us about human actions. And so there's a whole discipline of theology called moral theology, which kind of unpacks what Christian revelation says about human actions. It's going to get you to a lot of the same answers, but it's going to get you here in a different